Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Okay.
Welcome, friends, to episode 9 of the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that really runs through all other topics that we talk about when we talk about especially childhood trauma, brain development, epigenetics, all these things, and that's attachment. And specifically, if you're not kind of familiar with that word, attachment between a caregiver or parental figure and a child. And as we'll talk about and explore today, how critical that is to human development. And really look at that from a couple different angles. And as we always do, talk about the effects that trauma might have on parent-child attachment and some long-term consequences that if people don't get the help that they really need. So we have a really important topic today, again, that runs through so many other topics, but should be exciting as we explore this. As always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week, and we're going to sort of do a shared object as a sort of follow-up on episode 9's topic of triggers, re-traumatization. And really, we discussed a lot, if you weren't with us for episode 8, about the impact of a lot of the negative news, whether it's around the mass shooting, the sexual assault, sexual harassment, all these things going on that seems to be bombarding us, and what sort of impact that can have with people with traumatic histories, but just how that can really stress us out, even if we don't, or we've really worked through a lot of our past. And so our kind of collective bright, shiny object for the week goes back to the news. And if you're listening to this of this week, we're in sort of the second week of November, and elections were on Tuesday. We're recording this on a Thursday. And one of the things that I really took out watching those election results was there was so much diversity coming out of this election. For the first time in a couple places I found, and I don't trust my Facebook news feed very much anymore, so I really tried to go confirm this on other sites that I trust a little bit more. But I could identify 2 and confirm 2 transgender individuals who won elected office. The sort of the best known was in Virginia at a statewide office, who beat the self-proclaimed, I checked this out too, who took pride in himself being the chief homophobe of Virginia. So a lot of really powerful things happen, and I know a lot of people that listen, and the 3 of us who have worked with the trans community understands how the rates of suicide and homelessness in that community are just devastating. So to see them really come out in this way is a really big thing. Also, we see other LGBTQ folks win elections, sometimes for the first time, and a lot of diversity. And my favorite story, and I'm forgetting the geographic location, but there was a elected official who was a gentleman who at the Women's March put out a tweet saying that he hoped all the women would get back in time to cook dinner. Sort of angered one of his constituents who ran against him as she was female, and beat him. So, you know, some of the just feel-good stories, but a lot of diversity there. And I think it's an important follow-up to our last topic on how we can be triggered by this news. And as we mentioned in past episodes, and I'm sure for a lot of you it's not the first time hearing it, when we do get triggered, a lot of times we activate that amygdala, the fight or flight response. And a lot of times that's an illogical response, but it's really our emotional call to take action. And, you know, so you saw a lot of people not run away from the triggers, but go towards it and do something about it. And one of the other responses that we know that when people get stressed or again, experience things that borderline or we call trauma, is also to reach out and relate to others. And so it's just really cool to see people from communities that are really, you know, with the LGBT community and all the racial stuff going on in our country, that didn't go hide, but they stood up, they stepped up, and they organized. And at least from an electoral result perspective, have the opportunity to make some great change. So I think there's a huge lesson in here on so many different levels. And just kind of want to throw it out, Jerry or Kurt, if you have anything to add to this, any other insights or just reflections that you have on the current state of our country and the elections we had this week.
I mean, certainly one of the thoughts that I have is a realization and an understanding of how the information that we get can give us certainly some new perspectives on things. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things I was thinking as you were talking is that there is an incredible diversity of opinion and an incredible diversity of perspectives in our country. Yeah. And one of the things I've heard, one of the speakers I really like to listen to, he said there's really no reality in the world. There's only 6 billion perspectives on it. And, so all those things are out there, and we get information about what other perspectives out there that are different than our own. And some of those things can be certainly challenging to even hear about. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite movie lines is from the movie The American President, where if you remember the movie, like there's a speech where he's talking at the end. He says, one of the things that is so valuable about our country is that we have a country that is driven by our ability to express our opinions and protect our ability to do that, even when somebody says something that makes our blood boil. Yeah. And that's a bedrock of our country and a bedrock of our culture, and certainly can be something that is challenging in our relationships with each other. So those are the times that really I try and remind myself of that when I hear things that people say that make my own blood boil. That the challenge then is to stay engaged with that person and to continue listening and to continue being curious and learn what that other person's perspective is. And I've found that that's been a really valuable lesson to learn.
Absolutely.
Personally. So those are some of the thoughts that I had while you were talking, Matt.
Very cool. Jerry, anything to add?
Not a whole lot, other than I think that when we think about a healthy system, is the capacity to be differentiated and the capacity to have multiple perspectives on issues. But the research doesn't support that when we don't stay connected, that we're healthier. And so, you know, the best indicator of health is the strength of our social relationships. So as a country, as we struggle with many of these issues, really underlying a lot of these issues is some of the issues. For some people, one decision makes somebody feel safe and it makes somebody else feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And I think that the challenge for us is, how do we stay connected and feel safe and be differentiated enough so that we find innovative, creative solutions to really complex problems?
Yeah.
And I think the fact that people of diversity can put themselves in positions where their voice is heard only makes us better. Only makes us have a broader perspective on the problems that we face and brings those issues to the table. Even though it may make some people uncomfortable, I think your point, Kurt, is when we could stay open and curious, really creative solutions seem to emerge out of those kind of processes, rather than when we kind of get divided and around people that think like us, look like us, and act like us. So I really support, what you were saying about just being excited about people's taking the risk, one, to go out and run, and two is that other people support the challenge of bringing a diverse group of people together to solve these problems that we face.
Yeah, absolutely.
So see that challenge at so many different levels as well, not just at that happens at organizational levels, it happens at individual levels. And in any one of those groups, no matter how small it is or no matter how big it is, those challenges are the same. And which is one of the things I think is one of the great messages of a trauma-informed approach, is that it supports listening during those challenging moments. No matter how big the group is or no matter how small the group is. It's something that I certainly have taken away from this way of thinking about things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think actually that's a great transition when we talk about relationships to attachment. Because a lot of times what I see and where attachment plays such a big role in my thinking is in so many ways. And again, like I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this, like with trauma, an attachment style isn't a life sentence. And there's actually great research that it can change over time. But it does set at least an initial relational template for us, which plays out in every way, shape, or form, whether we're talking in the workplace, with romantic partners, with friends, in our own politics. When you start to understand attachment, boy, you see it everywhere. And so, again, that's why I call it just one of those underlining thing. And the title that we've chosen for this is Attachment, the Human Operating System, and really exploring that as such a foundational piece to who we are as human beings. So, Kurt, I know you're going to introduce the topic for us today, so I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I certainly gave some thought to this before we started talking today, and I thought, how could we introduce the topic to people who may not have heard it before? Mm-hmm. So I looked through as much literature as I could find, and I found a sentence that I thought was really interesting. I'm just going to read it, and hopefully that'll generate a little bit of thought among the three of us. One perspective on what attachment means boiled it all the way down to a biological instinct, and that biological instinct is that it drives proximity to an attachment figure when a child senses or perceives threat or some kind of discomfort, and that attachment behavior really anticipates a response from an attachment figure that either removes or attenuates that level of discomfort. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective, to take that all the way down to a biological instinct. Because one of the things that I think is interesting is how we talk about what's an instinct and what's not an instinct. And that's a level of analysis that is really pretty interesting to me, whether or not that is something that our genes could actually prepare us for, how important it is for children to be able to generate some response from a caregiver to help them to survive and to help them to navigate through their world. Certainly one of the things that has been a successful concept for me, teaching teachers and direct care staff and other therapists and a variety of people, is to think about babies. And oftentimes, even when you're across the table from somebody who is not an infant but is still having trouble with relationships, I think about the concept of fussing. Mm-hmm. And that when babies get either excited or sad or anything that dysregulates their homeostatic state, they fuss a little bit, they make some noise. And that can easily engender a response from an attuned caregiver, whether that be us smiling back at them, or whether that be us feeding them, or giving some warmth or a little bit of comfort or some touch. And that those early experiences are really formative in the behavioral sense of the term, whether or not the presence of people will function as a reinforcer or a pleasant event or as an unpleasant event. Mm-hmm. And that then can start to drive how a child interacts with others in really fundamentally different ways, whether a person functions as a reinforcer or whether a person functions as a punisher to another individual, is really a different pathway to relational interactions throughout the course of somebody's life. So those are some thoughts I had as we thought about what attachment is and how do we think about it and how does it play out in our lives on a moment-to-moment basis.
Yeah.
Some of the more even exciting research, I think, is that it's not a fixed thing.
Mm-hmm.
While it does have, and Bowlby thought this, many years ago in the 1960s, that there was some kind of a sensitive period where attachment was either going to happen or it wasn't going to happen. Of course, now we get new information, know that that's not quite true, that period is expanded, and then that we can do something about it if it goes wrong. But that also there's an adult side of attachment that we can generate new kinds of relational templates even as we get older. Mm-hmm. So some thought, it's a broad brush on attachment thinking and attachment theory and how we might be thinking about it, which is kind of what we have to do in these podcasts is jump on the top of a topic and skim the surface and then have some discussion about it. So one thing I thought in our title there about the human operating system is, Matt, I know you have read a lot about Sandra Bloom's idea of attachment being a human operating system, like Mac OS, like how does it make the whole system go? So I'd love to hear your perspective on that and hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I thought she did a great, I think it was in her book, Destroying Sanctuary, that she goes into detail around this. But I really thought it was a good way to look at both attachment and then trauma's role in attachment that she put forth in that book. And she compares that attachment relationship like the operating system of a computer. So if you're not a technical person, this can be your Windows operating system. If you're cooler than I am and have an Apple, I think it's OS something or the other. Fancy people with Apples know. But it's really what allows your computer to run effectively. And so if there's a healthy attachment, and I'm sure you'll probably hear this word a few times throughout this podcast, we often use the word secure base for that in the attachment vocabulary. So there's a really healthy relationship between the child and the parent where the needs are being met, and there's both emotional and physical needs are being met. And she says if attachment goes well, that it's like if your computer's running well, and if you click to open a Word document, the Word document comes up. If you want to open Spotify to listen to some music, Spotify pops up. So everything, and she compares the programs to social, emotional, cognitive, and other types of functioning. So again, if attachment has been healthy, then the computer works as it's supposed to work. If the attachment is not healthy, or even if there's trauma through, again, physical, emotional neglect or any type of abuse, in that, she compares that to basically your computer having a virus. And instead of, if you want to say Word represents emotional regulation, well, if your computer has a virus and you click Word, you might get an ad that pops up. And so what happens when there's not that secure base or healthy attachment, a lot of times when we need a certain type of function, whether that's emotional regulation, cognitive regulation, social, connections with other people, we oftentimes don't have the ability necessarily to bring up, sort of the right approach to what the environment is requiring. And I just thought that, looking at attachment as our operating system is a really good way to just put forth the power of attachment. To me, that it's been such a powerful thing. But if you made me open my computer and I think it's called Microsoft Basic or something, and try to program my own stuff in, I'd be miserable at it. So really looking at Windows allows me to use my computer. Attachment really allows a good view to really be successful in the world. And again, when that's disrupted or there's trauma involved in the relationship, that things just, we will struggle to bring the right energy, the right, kind of thinking or emotional regulation into those situations. And I thought that was, a really good thing. And always just to throw the positive in on that too, getting the right treatment and help is like getting a good antivirus software on your computer. And again, it's not a life sentence, but it shows the power of attachment if it's not able to heal.
Jerry, one of the things I've learned most from you is the concept that models are really useful for understanding complex things, but they're all essentially wrong. And that some of them are useful. Do you think that's a useful model for understanding attachment? And are there others that you know of that are helpful in understanding the importance of attachment and how we can help it to organize our actions?
It's a good question, right? So like every model, it has evolved over time, right? So when Bowlby was really looking at attachment, he really looked at animal models, right? So began to see that for mammals, because of our dependency, they come into the world expecting, so an experience expected that somebody would be there to meet them and kind of help make them safe. And that for us as a species, really being so dependent and vulnerable, for our own survival, it made sense that we begin to form some kind of connection to keep proximity to our caregiver. So it started out a lot with about proximity seeking, but people like Alan Shore and others began to understand, and as we began to look at the brain, we began to understand that not only is it about proximity, but that the immature nervous system of the infant uses the mature, more regulated nervous system to help regulate, and in that regulation help organize and in some ways facilitate development of the child's nervous system. So in that connection, in that communication, in those responsiveness, not only are we regulating the current state, but we're facilitating development of the nervous system in the future. So, we began to look at that and so that not only is it important, as Matt talked about, to create this secure base, which really has about us saying, in a secure base, I have the internal sense of security to go out and explore the world. But I also have this safe haven that when I get anxious or something overwhelms me, I can come back and be cared for. So, when we think about attachment, I like to think about 5 different things when I think about that for a healthy attachment. One is we start always with a sense of safety. Is that if I could go out and know that there's somebody there for me, I have an internal sense of safety. So safety becomes really important. And if you think about trauma-informed care, why safety is always that priority, physical, psychological. The next one is, can I be seen? Can I be known? So that does my caregiver really see my needs, who I am, so I'm differentiated but really connected to them? And that sense of being seen. After I'm being seen, my caregiver has to a combination of soothe me when I'm distressed, but also stimulate me when I need to be stimulated, so that my nervous system, my window of tolerance begins to expand and I begin to go out. So this combination of soothing and stimulating, and all of those combinations creates an internal sense of security, so that when I go out in the world, I can create relationships, I can have a sense of mastery, I can explore. So those 5 S's really allow what we know now is our self-organizing brain to maximize its potential to move to its highest level of complexity. So we move from this instinctual place to eventually moving to a place where we're intentionally making decisions about how we want to respond to the world. All of that takes place within the context of these relationships. The other important thing is there's an author, an anthropologist, Sarah Hardy, who wrote a book, I think it's called Mothering Others. And what she kind of found was that as a species, is that it's unlike other primates, when a great ape is born or a chimpanzee is born, that infant clings to the mother. And the mother doesn't let anybody else near that infant, so that this attachment is really to the mother. But if we think about us as a species, as soon as we're born, everybody in the room, so when my grandchild was born, I looked at him and said, oh, he's got my eyes. He got, right? So the clan claims the child, and the mother allows the child to be picked up and cared for by multiple others. So that we come into the world not only expecting a caregiver, but expecting other people in our lives to be able to care for us, so we can create multiple kind of attachments to different people, which allows us in some ways maybe to have an insecure attachment with one person, but a secure attachment with another. Mm-hmm. And so and as you talked about, Matt, is as we go along, we can actually earn secure attachments as we meet other people in the world. And so we not only attach to our caregivers, but we attach to our clan, mm-hmm. our family, to our culture, to many other kinds of things to kind of look at that. Mm-hmm. So, and all this is occurring at a time where there's no language. Yeah. So that when we think of attachment, it doesn't come up as if, just like on your computer, you don't go in and see your operating system. It just is there in the background. Attachment is the same way. So it organizes how I feel about things. It organizes patterns of behaviors I have. It organizes mental models I have about how I understand things, but it's not experienced as a memory. So it both is very powerful in that way, because it's outside of this conscious verbal memory process. But just like our breathing, we can intentionally pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. So if we're in a relationship, we can intentionally begin to identify those patterns and begin to make conscious decisions on how to change those things. So therapy really is about, in some ways at a basic level, helping an individual have a sense of creating a sense of security and safety within a relationship to build in new models of attachment.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, the more I think about it too, Jerry, I think you're absolutely right about the therapy creating, that secure attachment. And, I know I was trained, it freaked me out at first because you always like, oh, I'm not their dad, but, it doesn't, you don't have to be the parental figure for that attachment. But I just want to throw out there too is I think throughout our life, we look for that secure base. I think we look for it in employment with a supervisor. I mean, you look at people's productivity, if they trust their supervisor, they're your best self. I like to say to romantic partners, I really paid attention. I wanted to marry a wonderful human being because I wanted that secure base. And I was lucky enough to convince one to marry me and to stay with me for almost 10 years now. And so it's this, it's that just that we thrive as human beings in healthy relationships and secure relationships. And while we may not say, hey, we create a secure attachment at work, you look at all the business literature and we thrive when we create something at least similar to a secure base at work with our romantic partners. It kind of sets that homeostasis in a really positive way. I know I can go, out and explore the world and travel and push myself professionally because I come home and I'm loved by my wife most days and my dogs all the time. So, it's that in therapy, yes, but I think if you're a teacher in some ways, if you're a case manager, if you're an outreach worker, I mean, we're always looking, I think we need somebody to, and I know, Kurt, this is a topic that's on our list, really to attune with, because that's where I think we really grow as people and are able to take healthy risks in our life, whether that's, you know, trying to get back in the job market after being out of it for the years, or taking on a new challenge at work.
Mm-hmm. You know, the concept of attunement is one. Sorry, Jerry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, I was going to say, Kurt, could you talk a little bit about attunement? So go for it.
I was going to ask you to talk about attunement. you got to be quick to ask the question around here.
Yeah, I've got to be attuned.
One of the questions that I hear from people who I know who are listening to this podcast is that often they want to know, what do I do with my children when they go through struggles? How do I and they're really asking, I think, a question about attunement. Mm-hmm. How do I maintain my relationship with them when they go through something that is outside of me, right? So a child can go out and explore, and a child can get hurt when they explore, whether that be physically, whether it be emotionally, whether they see something, and so much of things are happening, you know, in the news that are dangerous and that are very scary. And they can come and ask their parents, or they can come and ask a teacher, or somebody, an adult who's around them in a caregiving role, and they'll ask how to make sense of those things. And so one of the things that I get asked most frequently is, how do I, as a person in these positions, talk to children, or talk to even older people who are adolescents and people who may work for you? How do I help people to make sense of that? And I think one of the answers to that question is to understand what attunement means, and how listening to others and asking questions and understanding what their needs are. I think that concept of being seen, Jerry, that you talked about is quite important there. When they let you know that they need to be seen, how do you then let them know that they are seen? And from either of you, some strategies that you've had experience with that have worked well, some ways to kind of guide people through how to have those interactions in a meaningful way, I think would be helpful to people who are listening.
So when we think about attunement, right? Think about an instrument, right? So if you are playing a violin and you stroke this violin, the chords vibrate, right? And they make this sound. And when we think about each other, our nervous systems are constantly reacting to the environment. And then we sense that, we feel it, and then we put some label. So I'm angry, I'm sad, but really it's some type of, in some ways, activation of our nervous systems. And kind of look at that. So that when we talk about attunement, is that I have to in some way start out and be with you, if I'm being attuned to you, and resonate with what you're feeling. So my body resonates with your internal, not with what you're saying, the content, but what you're experiencing. Mm-hmm. So how I kind of in training kind of talk about this is that when you're feeling good, that feels good to me, and I can kind of hang out with you and kind of be it. But when you're kind of communicating to me in a nonverbal way that your internal state is distressed, it's kind of like being in a room with a fire alarm going off. The fire alarm doesn't play nursery rhymes, because nursery rhymes would cause us to relax, right? The fire alarm is designed to send a signal that irritates our nervous system that makes us want to get up and leave. So when an infant cries, or a child is angry, or their communication is designed to create an internal experience in their caregivers. The caregiver has to pay attention not just to the content or behavior of the child, but first, what am I feeling as I resonate with you? Then I have to then take that experience and bring it up to my cortex, and then create a sense of meaning about how I respond to you. So this being seen is, attunement is, I'm not just seeing your behavior, what you're saying, I'm really seeing you and what your experience is. So that you get a sense that I understand what you're feeling. However, it's very important in this attunement process when we're as a parent, that a child doesn't want to say, I'm angry, and communicate I'm angry, and then watch you get angry at them. So they want to see that you get angry. You know what? When your friends don't show up, I know that that makes me angry too. So I feel what you feel, but I'm not as angry as you. So your feelings didn't contaminate me. I'm here to help you manage what you're feeling. So my recommendation to family parents is stop immediately thinking when your child is having a problem that you have to do something. The first thing you have to do is be with them with that problem and listen. And as you have said multiple times, be open and curious about what their experience is, and then really think my response has to be for what they need as opposed to trying to manage my own feelings. So this first part is about seeing, then it's about, is the next response, do I have to help them soothe what's going on with them? Or maybe I have to ask them a question to get them to explore what they're feeling, which is stimulating them to kind of look at that, right? So really, they're using me to help regulate their nervous system. That's attunement.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple of examples, Matt. I'd love to get your thoughts on them. I have one example of when I screwed this up, and I have one example where I think I might have done it a little bit better.
You only have one example where you screwed it up? I've got dozens to share. So.
So early in my career, I used to do consultations with mothers who were having problems getting their child to go to sleep. And one of the principles that I used here was that that there was a reinforcement problem here, right? That if the child cries, and that was to engender a response, and the child wasn't getting enough of an opportunity to let themselves fall asleep, and they needed more of an opportunity to do that. So I went through basically a planned ignoring approach where I said, you just got to let them cry it to sleep. And not that that was necessarily wrong, it was just really hard for a mother to do. Like they couldn't tolerate it, right? That was the fire alarm for them going off. And for them to have to tolerate their child crying was more than what they could be asked to do. And so I had to actually adjust my approach, and I'm actually glad that I did, where we put in a time period where you only have to tolerate it for so long. Just give them a little bit more of an opportunity that they can fall asleep, and let them have that opportunity to learn that they can fall asleep, and then go get them and pick them up and hold them. And that tended to work much, much better, where we just put a time limit on it. Later, many years later in my career, we had, I'm going to give an example of a story I call the little duckling intervention. And it was on a residential unit with young boys. And I was in a meeting with a bunch of supervisor and direct care staff, and they were really stressed out about having to treat 12 kids who were young boys who are really active. And one of the things that they started seeing was one of the boys would come up and stand next to all of the staff and say, I need this, or I need that, or I want to play video games, or can I do this, can I do that? And they were feeling very frustrated, and that they had explained to this young man how they couldn't do those things for him. And they would then say, I need you to go self-regulate, essentially. And they would, send the child to go take a minute and calm down. A well-meaning response. But when we changed our hypothesis about what the function of that child asking was, it changed our intervention. So it wasn't working what we were doing. And one of the things we said was, what if the way that this child is acting is driven by this young man's need to regulate his internal state, and he needs you for that. Mm-hmm. And the only way he knows how to do that is to come up and talk to you and ask you for things. He didn't have necessarily the social interaction skills to be able to say, hey, I'm feeling anxious, can you help me? A simple thing like that, right? He just hadn't learned how to do that. And so we changed how the staff responded to that, and changed how they thought that they were successful. And that what they said is basically, I can't give you that right now, but here's what I need you to do. Don't leave my side. Yeah. Don't go away from me, and stay next to me. And I mean, we did this also on our younger girls unit, same kind of age group, about 11 to maybe 13, 14. And some of the data from this one residential unit was, in 1 month, we had changed the number of events that occurred on that unit that we needed to do some kind of an intervention for a child, in an emergency type intervention. It went from 40 to 4 in 30 days. And that was just an incredible decrease. And they started calling it, interestingly, the little duckling intervention. One of the young girls actually, they coined that name of, I need to follow you around like a little duckling following its mother. One day I walked onto that unit, and I heard the staff calling out for where one of these young women was, and said, I can't find you, where are you? And I heard her quack from the corner of the room so that they could find her. She found a way to give them a sound to let them know where she was. But you know, it's really an important, I think, experience for me to go through when thinking back on when I had not done it well and when I thought maybe I had done it a little bit better. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Matt, as you travel around and hear people talking about these same kind of issues in classrooms, in residential units, with caseworkers, and so many people having to deal with when we get asked for things that we can't do, or we start getting overwhelmed with the amount of work and the amount of need, and just being able to let people be with us, how important that is.
Yeah, and I've started recently, probably for the last 18 months or so, I found, and in my nerdy search for good examples, there's a concept called spontaneous synchronization. And you can see this, there's a lot of YouTube, I'll put some links in the show note, of metronomes that are set at a current like beat, and they're designed to keep this beat basically no matter what. And this is used in music to make sure you stay on the beat. And what they'll do in these examples is they'll set these metronomes at all different beats, basically. So it's all chaotic. And when it's all in that chaos, what you'll see is usually one of the metronomes in the middle, you know, kind of keeps its beat. And over time, what you see, and this happens actually pretty quickly, relatively speaking, is all those metronomes sync up. And I love that as just a physical representation of an attunement. Is a lot of times, and I think most of the time when we're talking professionally, we're often out of sync. And we often go from one client to the other client. Sometimes we're working with a group of clients. But I also watch this with my friends who are parents as well. And it's been kind of a fun experience that I've got all these little things in my life now called toddlers and infants. And, I used to have these great parties where I would have all my friends up. I used to live up in the mountains, and we called it whiskey days. And that's all about, legally, I can disclose about my parties. But there would be these great parties, and all of a sudden all my friends started to breed and bring their infants to the party. And so it really changed everybody's behavior at our parties. But you, like me, nerding out at a party, I might have some idea of how to combine string theory with quantum physics for a unified theory of everything. And it's mom or dad, but let's just say I'm talking to mom, and I'm about ready to break through to solve the greatest problem in human history. And the baby cries. In other words, the baby's metronome kind of goes off beat. And, you have to watch it really closely with a healthy parent. But all of a sudden, when the mom, again, I love the fire alarm thing. When the mom hears the baby cry, mom's metronome sort of goes off beat for a second too. And she no longer cares about my unified theory of everything. It means nothing to her anymore, even though I was just ready to solve the greatest problem ever. But what I love to see, and especially because I don't have any children, I don't have to do this at 2 a.m., is then mom goes to the baby, mom takes a deep breath, and her metronome gets back to regulation and gets back to a steady beat. She gets regulated, right? She gets out of the amygdala response or whatever and gets back to the regulation. Baby's pooped itself, it's hungry, whatever babies cry for. And I love it when mom and dads do this too, reaches down, makes eye contact, picks up baby, and really tells baby it's okay. And over time, the baby learns how to regulate itself and not poop itself and feed itself and eventually go to college and do all that stuff. but it's those metronomes of how do we attune and sync with people. And I think with all the stress professionally that a lot of us hold, whether we're teachers, whether we're therapists, whether we're even leaders within organizations, we're so task-oriented that too often we miss opportunities to really focus on getting in sync with people. And so one of the authors, Restak, I believe, wrote in The Naked Brain, talks about, especially in helping services with a lot of our clients or kids that we work with who have not had good attachment experiences and may have been, I know with a lot of adult systems I work with, the system can actually abuse people a lot of times. And so they come in with these not so great experiences in the past in systems. And he talks about, a lot of times when we don't have that trust, when we don't have that safety, instead of releasing sort of the bonding chemical, which is sort of associated with a lot of this attunement, which is oxytocin, we're releasing dihydrotestosterone. And that sets us up to be out of sync with people. And so I always like to say that is when we're trying to get in sync to people, and we can talk about active listening skills and all those things, all those strategies we can do, we're not only just kind of starting from a normal baseline with a lot of our folks, but for people that have trauma, especially interpersonal trauma in their background, we're trying to help people understand that not everybody's out here to hurt you. And so, really looking at making sure that we professionally, but also as parents, really focus on our own self-care and our own emotional state, so we stay consistent in our approach, we stay predictable in our approach. What we can have happen over time, and for some people this will take longer than others, is we get that attunement eventually, and that's just incredibly healing. So we again can find so many lessons from the parent-child interaction. I think that resonates with our work. Again, I think it's just as important to attune with somebody in their 50s or 60s as it is for a 6-month-old. And so, there's such a healing power in that human connection that I love it. It just, if we didn't have that, it'd be such a bummer. But it's like we can heal from some of the most severe trauma if we can attune somebody that can help us, be present with us, be curious about us, and really sit with us through the pain and help us get beyond that too. So
the question I think that leads to, Jerry, I would love to hear your take on this, is people often say when they hear about attunement, do I have to do this all the time? Do I have to be attuned 100% of the time? Because I'm going to miss some opportunities. And I think that's a really important question for folks who are maybe hearing this the first time or thinking about this from a new lens. Like, what do we do when we're going to miss? And it's inevitable that we're going to be misattuned. What does the research say about that? And how often do we need to be in attunement?
So, the work of Ed Tronick up in Boston, looking at some of these issues, really found that a good, healthy parent is not perfectly attuned. As a matter of fact, so being perfect is not being perfect. So that when you're at a party listening to Matt talk about string theory and the meaning of the universe and not paying attention to your baby gets stressed and signals you. So during that time, they're having to learn how to tolerate that state. They're using their own self-regulating capacities. So they're trying to kind of manage it, but they signal their caregiver. So the caregiver then comes over after this period of stress and then supports the baby getting back into a state of regulation. So this concept of attunement is really about your child, not you reading their cues so accurately that they don't get stressed. Stress is really healthy, but that when you're not present, attentive, and responsive for a period of time, you then go back and repair that. Mm-hmm. So that there's this misattunement, reconnection, re-regulation that allows us to build our tolerance. So that kind of opens up the last thing in the time I want to talk about is you talked about that, young duckling that was kind of whining next to your staff. And your staff was really listening to the content of what he or she was saying to them. But when we look at Mary Ainsworth's work in the Baltimore study, looking at the strange situation, is really in the strange situation is where they put children really 12 to 18 months in this room with their caregiver. And then the first part of it is they bring a stranger into the room and the mother leaves. And then the mother returns, and then the stranger and the mother leaves and leaves the infant in there by himself, and then they return. And so really what it is those strange situations really is about a separation and then a reunification process. So that in that original study, they began to see really 3 different styles that children begin to adapt to their caregivers in order to survive and get their needs met. And one of them is a secure attachment. So when the mother is there, the child feels safe and secure and goes out and plays with the toys on the ground. When the mother leaves, that child begins to get stressed and stops playing and begins to look for their caregiver. But when the mother comes back in the room, the infant reconnects with the mother, gets soothed, and when they feel better again, they leave the mother and go back to play. That's secure. So this child has the ability to go out and explore, then come back to connect, get refueled, and then go back. But with other children, what ended up happening is when the mother came back, in one situation of this insecure attachment or non-secure attachment, they began to stay out there playing. They didn't go back to the mother. So it's almost as if they acted as if the mother wasn't important to them. So their behavior communicated, I don't really need you, Mom. But when they did physiological studies on them, looking at skin responses, their internal state was a state of high stress, but behaviorally they were acting as if they weren't stressed. So those people begin to say in themselves, I've got to develop a strategy where I don't need other people, but internally I'm still stressed and overwhelmed, so I can't communicate, right? The second strategy was when the mother came back, I sought connection to my caregiver, my mother in this case, and I looked at my toys, but I couldn't leave my mother because I didn't feel safe enough to leave, but I also wanted to go, which is that ambivalence, right? And so in a way, your little duckling had to stay next to their caregiver asking all those questions, but they also wanted to go out and play with the toys they were asking about. And so if your staff, rather than listen to the content of what they were asking, realized that this child, they weren't able to soothe them with the responses they gave them. But that child couldn't leave because they needed to stay close. And so they really had this ambivalent attachment to the staff, which was a reenactment of their earlier connections, right? And so you, in your wise mind, began to say, let's change the paradigm so that we can begin to stay close to me. And when you're now feeling safe and secure, you can explore and kind of looking at those things. So later on, Mary Main and her staff discovered the disorganized attachment, where the child got somewhat, I couldn't leave and couldn't come back, got into this crazy state. But really all of these states correlated with the adult's style of attachment, right? And in the minute I want to talk about that for a second is that disorganized attachment, even though it's the most disturbing to see a child not having a strategy to manage it, is also the most successful changing with therapeutic input. Is that when we can help people resolve their early childhood issues, they can change to one of the more either insecure attachments or secure attachments. So that what we found is it's not what happens to people when they were younger, but it's how people make sense of what happens to them when they're younger. So you can have a really difficult early life, but if you can somehow make sense of that and find meaning of it, and in some ways allow yourself to, in some ways, be different in the current environment, rather than, you can actually turn a negative experience into something positive in your life, which leaves people with this sense of resilience. So that what we most can do, we can't go back and change people's lives, but we can help them look at it and create new meaning for them, as opposed to, I can't tell anybody what I feel and need because everybody's going to not care, or I have to stay in kind of, because I'm not enough. We can create new meaning and let people, in some ways, using Max Learn, have post-traumatic growth and resilience later in life.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful way to start wrapping up. And I think the takeaway experience is that relationships are just incredibly healing. In my research on how people change behavior, you see attunement playing, again, a similarly critical role. And it's for especially those of us, I think as parents as well, but as those in the helping professions or in education, we have to be someone that people want to attune to. And attunement from us, I think it's one of the most amazing parts of our work, but it's also takes a lot of energy on our part as well. And so, again, I always like to leave with a message of self-care, making sure that if you think about that metronome reference, that we are able to keep that steady beat. And we keep a beat in an emotional context that people want to resonate with and that can learn to trust over time. And so, again, if I think with all the requirements, all the testing in education, all the paperwork in social services, so often we get pulled all these directions, but over and over and over, research shows that the number one driver of outcomes is really the quality of the relationship, and that we can help people, really reset that traumatic template or attachment template, even if they didn't have that good experience. And, there's all kinds of hope through healthy relationships. And I think that's a great way to end, and probably a million things unsaid still about this topic to come up in the future. But Kurt, Jerry, thanks for another great episode. You can always catch our show notes. We'll put some links in there as well at traumainformedlens, all one word, .org. I'll also put some links in there too. I've started to do a quote of the day from our podcast as well on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So if you're on any of those social medias and just can't get enough of us, we can drop some quotes, highlights of our shows in your social media as well. So thank you, guys. Everybody take care of themselves, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.